Hi friends, it's Katie from the Annapolis Maritime Museum. Today we are going to talk about one of my favorite Chesapeake Bay critters, the superheroes of the Chesapeake Bay. I hope you know what critter I'm talking about. It's the eastern oyster. So we're going to do a couple cool demonstrations and show you some really interesting things about them, so keep watching. All right, we're here today at the park campus of the Annapolis Maritime Museum, right across the water from our museum campus, and we are going to pull an oyster cage. So this is where we keep some of our live oysters, plus there's a bunch of just shell in there, and we're going to take some of those live oysters back into the classroom for a little bit to do a filtering demonstration to see how they clean the water, because I'm sure you might have heard that they are an amazing filter for the Chesapeake Bay. So they help eat the algae out of the water, the stuff that's kind of making the water look a little greenish. And they also do something with the sediment, so we'll learn more about that later. That's kind of one of the main things that they're known for. But there's also another amazing thing that oysters help with, and that is that they provide habitat. They provide habitat for all these little tiny creatures. So we're gonna pull up an oyster cage, and we're gonna see if anyone else is home besides our oyster friends. So let's go. All right, so this is one of our oyster cages. You can see it's full of some live oysters. We're gonna take just a couple of those back, see if they can filter some water for us and do a really cool demonstration. It's also full of some oyster shells, all right? So these are called boxes when the oyster's no longer alive in there. And the way that the oysters provide habitat is really cool. So their shells, they don't fit perfectly together when they stack on top of each other. And this is how they like to grow. They love to grow stacked on top of each other. So just like coral, we call it a coral reef when they all grow on top of each other, we call this an oyster reef. This is kind of an artificial or fake oyster reef because I'm just holding it together. And these guys are all loose oysters. But when they are stuck and they grow on top of each other, they actually like glue themselves together. When they're babies, they'll stick onto something hard and they'll grow. So they'll form these really awesome habitats, kind of like an apartment building. There's lots of nooks and crannies, and there's lots of critters that like to hide in these different apartments. So we're gonna take a few more of the live oysters. The way I know that they're live is that I cannot pry them apart. So, oysters, 2 shells, closed. They're called bivalves, bi meaning 2. So if we take a look, we'll also see that there are some other critters that love to live in and around the oyster reef. So it's kind of hard to see, but I'm going to put these critters in here with ones that I caught earlier and let you see. So we've got all of these little guys squirreling around in there. We're going to take some of these back to the park, and we're gonna work on identifying them using something called a dichotomous key. So I'll teach you how to use that in a little bit. But all of these little critters were hiding in and among those oyster shells. So we call them reef critters because, again, they live on the oyster reef. And the reason why they love living on the oyster reef, for a couple reasons. They love all the hiding places that they have from predators. Look, they're so tiny. Lots of other animals would love to eat them. And oysters help clean the water. So they're living in a spot where the water is gonna be a lot cleaner than other spots around because oysters are there filtering the water. So we're gonna take some of these back into the classroom and take a look and try to identify some of them. So come with me and you'll see that next. Hello again, so we're back in the classroom and we are going to look at the critters, some of the critters that we caught from the oyster reef, and we'll put them back where they came from right after we're done looking and identifying them. But we're also going to set up a filtration demo. So we have those live oysters that we had in our oyster cage, and we're gonna put them in this container over here. And so I have 5 live oysters going in, and there are no oysters in this container. They both have the same water right from Back Creek. So we're gonna look to see if there's any difference in the clarity of the water. In about 15 minutes, 20 minutes, we'll see if they did anything to the water. So hopefully, we're thinking that they might be eating some of this green stuff, some of the algae that's in the water, and maybe doing something with the sediment that's in the water as well. So we will check back in on that in a little bit. We'll give them some peace and quiet and let them eat and do their job. All right, so we're gonna look at some of these critters that we caught. So again, these are the critters that live in and among the reef, and I don't see anybody in here right now. Well, and that's because I put some shells in here. So where do you think they went? Under the shells. So we're gonna take a look and see if we can find, oh, there's somebody. So, oh, if I can catch them. There's a lot of somebodies. So when we're dealing with aquatic critters, we always wanna make sure our hands are wet and we keep them out of the water for as little time as possible. So we are gonna work with this dichotomous key over here to try to identify our organism. So a dichotomous key is a tool that scientists use to try to identify different organisms or any different things that they're trying to identify. Something that we don't know what it is just yet, but we're gonna look at some observable characteristics of it. And the word dichotomous, di, the prefix, means two. So what this kind of questionnaire has you do is you look at the first question and it breaks the organisms into two different categories, two different mutually exclusive categories. So the answer to the question can either be yes or it can be no. It can't be something in between. If it asks you, is it red or is it green? It can't be blue. So if there's a blue organism, this guide wouldn't work for it, this dichotomous key. So this dichotomous key that we have is to work on looking at oyster reef critters, the animals that live in and among those oyster shells. So to look at this little guy, to identify him, we want to ask ourselves these questions. And we always start at the top, start at the beginning. So the first question here is, does it have an exoskeleton? So if you think about an exoskeleton, something hard on the outside, kind of like a shell, or like our skeleton, but on the outside. So this little guy, I can feel him. Oh, yep, he definitely has a hard shell. Thankfully, he's too small to pinch me. So does he have an exoskeleton? Yes. So we follow that question, that answer, to a new question. It's kind of like a choose your own adventure. So yes, it does have an exoskeleton. Well, the next question we have is, does it have two shells? Well, I don't really see a hinge, like an opening and closing for two different shells like our oysters have. So no, it doesn't have two shells. It just has one continuous shell around it. So I follow the no answer. Does it have claws? Oh, yes, this little guy definitely has some claws. They're quite small, but he's got some claws. So he's a mud crab. Excellent. So always at the end, we want to make sure that that makes sense. So does that make sense? He's a mud crab? I think so. If you had gotten to the end and you were like, well, it's an aquatic worm. That doesn't look like a worm to me. So you'd have to go back. Maybe you got one of the questions wrong. Maybe it wasn't something that you were kind of obvious, something that you were kind of learning. So you could go back and look up a word like vertebra. Vertebra, think about your backbone. Those are all your vertebrae. So if you're up for a challenge, we have this dichotomous key and some pictures of some organisms on our website that you can look through and you can work on identifying using a dichotomous key. So let's see if we can catch one of these in our bucket, and we'll work through that one as well, because this one has a really cool feature that I want to show you. All right, so we're gonna first put our mud crab back in. I'll try to catch one of these jumpy little guys. So they love to hide under the oyster shells. All right, so I got one. So this might be really hard to see, but I'll hold it out for you in a moment, all right? Here's a really good picture of it. So first things first, does it have an exoskeleton? That's our first question. So think about if you've ever eaten a critter like this. It would have been quite a bit bigger than this one, but think about, it's kind of like a shrimp. If you've ever eaten a shrimp, do you peel something off of the shrimp? Yes. So shrimp do have exoskeletons. So we're gonna answer yes for this one again. Does it have 2 shells? No, no shells that I see. All right. Does it have claws? No, I don't see any claws. Does it have a horn over its eyes, like a unicorn? Well, let's see. So it's kind of hard to see on the actual organism, but if we look at the picture, and I'll try to show you in a moment on this little guy, you see this thing right here? It does have a horn over its eyes. So if I can try to show you on this friend here, again, wet hands, ever holding an aquatic critter, gotta have wet hands. All right, let's see if I can see that horn over its eyes. Maybe I'll hold it over the white as well. I think it works best against the black. So they have this horn over their eyes. So this little guy, he's quite small, but to protect himself from things that are a little bit bigger, this horn is actually quite pokey. So if you ever picked up this guy, and let's see, oh, it was called a grass shrimp. If you've ever picked up a grass shrimp and felt a little poke, that is from the horn over its eyes. So that's for protection there. So excellent. All right, we'll do one more organism. All right, so for this one, we actually get a 2-for-1. So there's 2 friends in there. All right, and we'll start with question number 1. Does it have an exoskeleton? Well, it kind of looks like our shrimp guys again, similar. So I'm gonna say yes. We'll see if we get to an answer that we think is about right. All right, does it have 2 shells? No. Does it have claws? No. Does it have a horn over its eyes? Well, I see little antenna. Let me flip to a picture. See if we can see something that looks, these are other reef critters as well that you can work on identifying. Oh, I think our other guy might have been back towards the beginning. That was our grass shrimp. Oh, there we go. So this guy, it's really hard to see all the features when they're really small in real life. But if we zoom in and look at a big picture, there's no horn over its eyes, just these 2 interesting antennae that are coming out here. All right, so does it have a horn over its eye? No. So these friends, these guys in here are amphipods. So again, all of these critters are critters that live in and among the oyster shells, that hide in here. So we've got a few more in there even as well that quickly scurry to go find their little homes. So work on, if you're up for the challenge, go online and use our dichotomous key and pictures of organisms that you would find in and among the oyster reef and work on identifying them. See if you can be like a scientist and figure out what critters you're looking at, what pictures you're looking at. All right, so we're gonna check back in a few minutes to look at how our oysters are doing and see if they've been able to filter the water. So we'll see you again in a minute. So we are checking back in on our oysters. It's been about half an hour. And let's see if we can tell the difference between these 2 containers of water. So this one over here has our 5 adult live oysters in it, and this one over here has no oysters. So there's a lot of sediment down in the bottom of both of these containers. So you can see just with time, the sediment can settle out. But there still looks to be a little bit difference between the clarity or the color of these 2 containers. So these oysters in here have been doing their job. They're filtering the water, they're eating the algae, stuff that's kind of making the water look a little bit green. And they're doing something with the sediment. So they take the sediment and they kind of like ball it up with a little bit of mucus, kind of like snot. And they excrete it a little bit differently than poop. So we call it pseudo-feces or fake poop. But when they combine it with that mucus, it makes it heavy and it sinks to the bottom. So you can see down in the bottom of this container, there's a lot of sediment down here. Some of that has gone through the oysters and their digestive system and come out in these pseudo-feces and feces as well with all the sediment and all the algae that they've eaten. And over here, that sediment has just settled out on its own, but the oysters have definitely made that water clearer than the tank with no oysters in it at all. So we have a lot to thank our oyster friends for. The thing that they're known the most for, of course, is that they filter the water, but then they also provide habitat, and we saw that. They're great for the economy, and they're really quintessential in the culture of Maryland if you look back over time. So we thank our oysters, and we hope they keep doing their job. These guys will go back out in the bay soon, and we can help the bay as well and work on providing good habitat for the oysters and making sure the bay is clean enough that the oysters can survive. They're pretty hardy, but they need us to do our job too. All right, so thanks for tuning in, and we hope to see you around the park and the museum soon.